Our final speaker from the platform this morning, or this afternoon as it now is Vinay Venkatraman of the Copenhagen Institute of Interaction Design, of which he is the co-founder. His passion is finding appropriate technologies to provide new models of sustainable socio-economic development. He's helped some very large companies like Intel, Nokia, Maersk, and Philips, and here he is to help us. Thank you.
So I realize that I'm the man between you and your lunch today. So I'll try to keep it brief. So I'm going to speak mainly about how perhaps we can think about technology as one of the ways of tackling or combating poverty. But before I start, I want to start with a little anecdote. So in the late 90s, when I was still at design school in India, a professor of mine, he was embarking on a very interesting project on developing a family planning program for a district in Rajasthan, western part of India. And he and his research team basically identified that the real challenge is to get to the woman of the house and to address some of these rather delicate issues about birth control and family planning to people who are mostly reclusive, who do not know to read and write, and who do not discuss these issues beyond a very close-knit circle of family and friends. So they came up with a rather ingenious idea of using these antiquated technology. These ViewMaster things. I'm sure you've seen them all as kids. And they developed this as a platform because they thought it was simple, it was cheap, or relatively inexpensive. It was discreet, and it was quite visual. Yeah? But then a few months passed on, and they did a small pilot run, and something really strange happened, something really unexpected. Of course, it raised awareness levels. It raised those kinds of indicators very well. But then no one had thought about eye infections. So this was a very strange situation where this device was being used aggressively to help people learn, adopt new practices, and plan their resources and families better. But there was a remarkable rise, almost an epidemic of eye infections that were passing on in that district. So this leads to a really strange question as to what does technology really do sometimes? It is actually a double-edged sword. If it's used in the right ways, it goes a long way. If it's not used in the right ways, it can actually be counterproductive. So my hypothesis is that an artifact or a software alone cannot solve complex systemic issues. I think there's a misnomer that by investing in technology, we would automatically reduce large global issues. So the better way of looking at it is to think about how do you create ecosystems for technology to empower people. I think that is the overall message today. And I would want to show you some of these examples of different kinds of work that we have done at CIID, and also referencing some of our students' work. I want to start with this little story about an inexpensive television. A couple of years ago, we were researching what happens when these large banks and big multinational companies throw away their e-waste. So, there was, a few years ago, there was this big transition from these CRT monitors onto flat panel, like LCD systems. And so banks and big institutions were just throwing away large amounts of computer monitors, these old CRT monitors. So we discovered by following the trail of electronic waste that much of this was happening in the city of Mumbai in India, was actually that there was an entire ecosystem of people who were salvaging all this e-waste. And what they were doing was they were stripping them apart and refurbishing them with television tuner kits. So they were converting a computer monitor into a television because it had most of the componentry required to make a television out of this. And they were retrofitting it, and they were converting them, and they were selling them in really unique ways. And there was an entire industry of kits, people who were manufacturing subcomponents and modules to basically fuel this industry. There was a very interesting ecosystem evolving here. And they were actually packaged and sold to rural markets. So they were sold in such a way that they were actually piggybacking on the transport infrastructure of passenger buses, and they were utilizing every little space available in these buses to actually ship television to rural markets in Maharashtra. So you could actually buy a color television with a warranty for 30 euros. You wonder how this warranty works, and there's a very, very unique story to that too, because the warranty works simply because it's so easy to fix it almost anywhere. That's the reality about technology in a different context. Today, if your TV is broken, you'll probably call some call center that's going to come and maybe ask you to ship the thing back, and it's going to go to some electronic waste dump, and then there's going to be a new television that's probably going to drop in your living room someday. But this is not how it happens in those parts of the world. So there's an entire tinkering ecosystem where it's not just the product that travels, it's also knowledge that travels. So knowledge about technology is as important as the product itself. This happens on the streets. This happens in Mumbai. This happens in Cape Town. These are places where we've done research. This happens in Doha. This happens in Bangkok. And it's ubiquitous to almost every kind of developing country. It's invisible. You don't see it because it's hidden away in small streets, in nooks and crannies, in small kiosks. But there's an entire underground, I call it the creative underground, that's actually fueling all this. It's supplied by low-cost tools and supplies that come from different parts of the world. There's a lot of salvaging culture where computer parts and electronic waste are stripped apart and sold in components. There are books and manuals to do this. This is the most amazing part. There's two components to it. There's the codified knowledge and the non-codified knowledge. And the codified knowledge is somehow captured in these books and manuals, and the non-codified knowledge is actually captured in word of mouth and apprenticeship models. And there are numerous training institutes that informally train aspiring people to give them new livelihoods. This does not happen in a university, no. But it does happen right outside a university. For example, in Mumbai, right outside the Indian Institute of Technology, which is one of the most prestigious technical schools in India, there's a unique mobile repairing institute. And the institute is no bigger than 40 square meters, where they train 200 students a month on creating new kinds of livelihoods for them. But the dichotomy here is that there are traditional crafts and what I call as technology crafts. And the mix and the interplay of these two things is what is a really powerful combination. So basically what this gives you is a fix-it locally culture. It gives you cheap fabrication and very large math for low cost, because semiconductor technology has reached such heights that it can actually benefit people in all levels of society. This is what I try to define as the silicon cottage industry. This was the predominant paradigm before the Industrial Revolution, and now it's revolving itself in the creative underground in most developing countries. So based on these principles, we run a research track called Frugal Digital, which is basically about rethinking appropriate technology platforms and applying them in new contexts and creating solutions out of them. So what we've done is, as part of this process, we've done several projects as pilot cases to exemplify how this sort of potential can be harnessed. So we have done a projection system for digital classrooms where there's no infrastructure. How do you run an electronic curriculum with no electricity and very little classroom infrastructure? This is some of the challenges where we try to address how to empower teachers with very little knowledge. We've actually built a simple projector called the lunchbox, because it's actually made from a plastic box that's brought in from a lunchbox, based on simple mobile components. There's an entire TED talk on this one. If you are interested, you can go take a look. We worked with frontline healthcare workers. These are ASHA workers in India who are foot soldiers of the healthcare system to empower them with digital tools, but in a very unconventional way. We've actually developed a simple medical diagnostics platform based on an alarm clock. Why an alarm clock? Because it's analog. You don't need to know how to read and write in order to understand what it means. It's really ubiquitous. You can buy one for €2 almost everywhere. It has most of the componentry required to build a sensor system. So we've actually developed a pulse oximeter, a blood sugar monitor, a blood pressure monitor, and a heart rate monitor using this, which are very interesting parameters to sort of do simple screening with different kinds of health programs. Very, very critical to maternal health and child development too. And we're doing numerous field testing in different parts of India right now, and we're collecting data. We're trying to engage with a large organization to actually do a clinical trial on this. We've done a community radio service, a two-way community radio platform in South Africa, where we've actually tried to create or take a simple mobile phone and convert it into a small FM transmitter community radio. And it's not just a one-way broadcast like conventional radio. It allows people to call back onto the phone and leave messages. So it's a radio-based bulletin board of some sort. And this is something that we are right now experimenting with, and it's based on a really simple Android smartphone. It cost about $100 net to make this thing, and it has a range of about half a kilometer. It's kind of just under the permissible limits of what non-licensed broadcasting can do. And it's amazing to see the responses that you get from these things. People get so engaged because they feel that they have built the technology ecosystem. It's empowering people by allowing them to make it themselves. So there's the tinkering ecosystem, and then there's the disruptive technologies, which I also want to quickly hint to you. One of them is 3D printing. You would think this sounds like science fiction because this stuff happens in science labs and in very advanced industrial setups. No, it's become ubiquitous. It's become cheap. You can buy one and build yourself one for very little cost. And this is going to actually transform the way people are going to make their own solutions very soon. There's a lot of nanotechnology stuff that's going on, which is under the radar right now, and no one's taking notice because it's not yet large scale enough. But soon, in almost a decade or so, I can almost see this hitting us in a big way. There's actually an Oxford-based research lab that's actually working on nanopore technologies, which I think will have profound impact because they can do really advanced screening and healthcare-based solutions on a little USB key, more or less, today. The third big trend is reconfigurable computing. Today, there's so much electronic waste because once the purpose and the objective of something is over, it's kind of trashed. But reconfigurable computing is really the paradigm where the same silicon semiconductor can be sort of internally reconfigured in its architecture to deliver a different kind of solution once the original purpose of what it's supposed to be doing is over. So stuff like this is coming. It's still far off. We'll probably see it in about a decade, but we have to be ready for this as an organizational system and as a policy initiative. So empowering people is really about, I think, engagement and humanizing technology. So it's about bringing in a balance between usability and desirability, making it people-centered. And it's also about crowdsourcing and community participation. I just want to show you one last case before I sign off. We are working right now on a very interesting pilot on creating a referendum system for something called as the village panchayat system. In India, there is a concept of a panchayat, which is like 5 head figures, which are like a local governance model for most villages. The problem with that is that it's not equally represented, and it's not franchised enough for everyone to contribute in a referendum. So we want to change that model, and we want to piggyback on an ancient infrastructure. So the real question for people is, how do I get heard? Can I participate? And how do I do it in any kind of referendum? So we are trying to reduce the barrier, lower the gaps here, and make a system that makes it happen this way. And India, coincidentally, has a very huge copper infrastructure laid out because of a concept called the public call office, like these public phone systems that were there. These are losing relevance today. Almost everyone's getting a mobile phone, and very soon all this is going to be mountains, heaps of scrap. So before that happens, we want to preempt the situation and try to create a referendum infrastructure based on this copper infrastructure that's actually available today on the street level. So what we've done is that two of our students are right now working on creating a very simple biometric-based platform that sort of converts a payphone into a referendum engine, more or less. So let's watch a little quick video from this.
डेली पंचायतमध्ये आपले स्वागत आहे. कृपया तुमच्या उजव्या हाताचा अंगठा स्कॅन करा. जानेवारी 2013 करताचा प्रश्न आहे. यंदाची पाणी टंचाई लक्षात घेता पाण्याचा काटकसरीने वापर होण्यासाठी प्रत्येक घरात पाणी मीटर बसवावे का? जर तुमचे उत्तर हो असेल तर 1 दाबा, नाही असेल तर 0 दाबा. तुम्ही उत्तर दिलं हो. आपलं मत नोंदवण्याकरता धन्यवाद.
So it's quite straightforward. It's simple to use. It's easy to piggyback on an existing infrastructure. And it's relatively simple because it's audio-based. There isn't too much that you need to do in order to engage. So the key principles that we are trying to put there is to make amendable technologies, basically make things that people can change and transform and fix. It's so important. And we want to encourage open and extensible standards. And I know that technology standards are right now going through this big war about who's going to dominate the market, and everything from Blu-ray discs to whatever USB standards. And I think open and extensible standards is a key. And this audience today is particularly important because you can have huge influence in these standards if you want to. And that will shape how you actually help people climb out of poverty. And designing in the context and not just for the context is also important, because there's a lot of projects that I encounter which is all done in nice labs and in a fancy sort of corporate setting. It never trickles down to reality simply because it's too far away from what people can actually manage themselves. And most importantly, encourage simplicity in some way. The last thing I want to say is that it's not just technology that's going to make all this transformation happen. We have to factor in the human capital, and human capital is available in abundance in most places. This is an example from Cuba. I'm sure some of you are aware that there's a kind of a transport infrastructure issue in Cuba because of all the sanctions and things like that. So there isn't enough public transportation infrastructure really happening, especially in rural Cuba. So the Cuban government has come up with this rather ingenious system of allowing or facilitating a hitchhiking model that's highly organized and systematically done based on this man, or an example of a person who stands literally on the roads and manages a database. So this man is basically a network router and a database. That clipboard in his hand is the database of traffic patterns in his area that allows him to facilitate a hitchhiking model on all kinds of public vehicles that are traveling in the roads of Cuba. This is ingenious because it is simply low-tech and it actually works beautifully. So technology, I think, is about empowering people to help themselves. And if we can do that, I think we will go a long way in making this happen. Thanks.